Meet Céline Goren, a 24-year-old national spokeswoman of the left-wing youth movement Solid and refugee activist in Mannheim, Germany. In January this year, she was raped by 3 men, then lied to police about the ethnicity of her attackers because she was worried about the possible backlash against them and members of the refugee community. Yeah, just let that sink in for a minute. Quote, Céline, aware of the backlash that migrants suffered after the events in Cologne on New Year's Eve, when hundreds of women were sexually assaulted and robbed by marauding gangs of immigrant youths, instead said she was robbed and said her attackers spoke German. So let's get this straight. After the Cologne attacks, her primary concern was not for the hundreds of women that were sexually assaulted and robbed, and not for her own safety, but the backlash against migrants. You just can't make this shit up. This is what happens when you buy into the oppression Olympics of identity politics. So how does this work? Presumably, if her attackers had been white German males, then there'd be no need to lie, because they're at the top of the oppression pyramid. But what if her attackers had been 3 pre-op transvestites? They're oppressed. They face backlash. Who are you going to blame that one on? You were raped. That's it. You report it to the police and give as much detail as you can so they have the best chance of tracking down the perpetrators. You should be insulted that this has to be explained to you. But how did she develop this misplaced empathy for refugees? Well, quote, Céline, who has visited refugee camps in Iraq, where she was shocked at the squalor people are living in, did not want to stoke more hatred against migrants in Germany. So this is tantamount to because feelings. But it gets better. Quote, to help her cope, she wrote an open letter to a fictional refugee and posted it on Facebook. It read in part, I'm really sorry that your sexist and line-crossing treatment of me could help fuel aggressive racism. Wow, could you imagine how feminists would flip out if a male described rape of a woman as line-crossing treatment? Yeah, he just engaged in a little line-crossing treatment. It goes on. Quote, I'm going to scream. I will not stand by and watch, and it can happen that racists and concerned citizens name you as the problem. You're not the problem. You're usually a wonderful human being who deserves as much as any other to be safe and free. I will not stand by and watch and let it happen that racists and concerned citizens name you as the problem. Consider the level of reality denial it takes to adopt that position. This is essentially a not all argument. That is, we shouldn't generalize to an entire community, in this case refugees, based on the actions of a few representatives of that community. Now, the vast majority of people who can think logically understand this, but it takes a special kind of moral confusion to take that to the level of outright lying about a heinous crime to protect against a possible backlash. Now, it should be said that this woman was convinced by a friend to go back to the police, tell the truth, and she has subsequently somewhat come to her senses. Quote, she now says people must never twist the truth, even if it is politically expedient to do so. Well, thanks for that, Captain Obvious. Now, defenders of this kind of stupidity would say that this woman means well, that her heart is in the right place, that she's empathetic to the struggle of refugees. And because most people think empathy is a universal good, then at the end of the day, she's a good person that just got a little carried away with her cause. But I want to push back against this notion that empathy is always and everywhere a universal good, and in fact can often lead to bad decision-making on a scale much more damaging than the case discussed previously. So I want to draw on the work of psychologist Paul Bloom in an article titled Against Empathy that appeared in the Boston Review nearly 2 years ago. In it, Bloom argues that, quote, empathy is biased. We are more prone to feel empathy for attractive people and for those who look like us or share our ethnic or national background. And empathy is narrow. It connects us to particular individuals, real or imagined, but it is insensitive to numerical differences and statistical data. As Mother Teresa put it, if I look at the mass, I will never act. If I look at the one, I will. Laboratory studies find that we really do care more about the one than about the mass, so long as we have personal information about the one. In light of these features, our public decisions will be fairer and more moral once we put empathy aside. Our policies are improved when we appreciate that 100 deaths are worse than one, even if we know the name of the one, and when we acknowledge that the life of someone in a faraway country is worth as much as the life of a neighbour, even if our emotions pull us in a different direction. And this is obvious, for example, when you see the reaction to the shooting of a single black man in the United States by a police officer. Literally within hours, the media has pieced together a personalised story of the victim that people can empathise with. But half a dozen deaths of black men over a weekend in Chicago doesn't garner the same attention. The stories aren't personalised, so the victims are nameless and faceless. The media knows this, and they do it on purpose, and of course with the added dimension of race involved. But that's a whole other video. Another example, we hear about a man that kills his wife. Very quickly, we have a personalised story of the victim, and the next thing you know, millions of dollars are being funneled into campaigns to stop violence against women, when we know that all the objective evidence suggests that domestic violence is not a gendered issue. Over-empathising leads to bad policy decision-making. Bloom goes on to discuss Simon Baron-Cohen's analysis of empathy and notes that a person operating at the highest level of empathy, according to Cohen, is, quote, in a constant state of hyperarousal, such that other people are never off their radar. And Cohen goes on to give a glowing example of a particularly empathetic psychotherapist named Hannah. But Bloom pushes back with the following. Hannah is compelled by hyperarousal. Her drive is unstoppable. Her experience is the opposite of selfishness, but just as extreme. A selfish person might go through life indifferent to the pleasure and pain of others, 99 for him and 1 for everyone else. While in Hannah's case, the feelings of others are always in her head, 99 for everyone else and 1 for her. And Bloom notes that women are more prone to this extreme type of empathy, and thus why they are twice as likely as men to experience depression, citing research showing, quote, this divergence is explained in part by a sex difference in the propensity for unmitigated communion, defined as an excessive concern with others and placing others' needs before one's own. Then Bloom cites the work of Barbara Oakley on pathological altruism, who notes, quote, it's surprising how many diseases and syndromes commonly seen in women seem to be related to women's generally stronger empathy for and focus on others. Bloom then discusses the difference between empathy and compassion by noting a few examples. The best illustration is the idea of long-distance charity. Quote, or consider long-distance charity. It is conceivable, I suppose, that someone who hears about the plight of starving children might actually go through the empathetic exercise of imagining what it's like to starve to death. But this empathetic distress surely isn't necessary for charitable giving. A compassionate person might value others' lives in the abstract and, recognizing the misery caused by starvation, be motivated to act accordingly. Summing up, compassionate helping is good for you and for others, but empathetic distress is destructive of the individual in the long run. So let's bring this back to the idea of over-empathizing causing destructive decision-making on a grand scale, and consider the example of the recent Austrian elections, where the left-wing Greens candidate narrowly defeated the right-wing anti-immigration party by a little more than 30,000 votes. But what's interesting is the voting patterns by gender, as illustrated by this graph. Women overwhelmingly voted for the leftist party and men for the anti-immigration party. In particular, approximately 2/3 of women under the age of 29 voted against the anti-immigration party. And here's a quote from the text that accompanied the graph. Quote, "The case has been made that women are playing a disproportionate role in the immigration catastrophe engulfing Europe, that they are more xenophilic than men, more emotional and indulgent, overrepresented in the ranks of migrant charities and help groups and the like." Now, I admit to not knowing much about Austrian politics, and other than standing for a curb on immigration, I don't know what other policies the right-wing party is running on. But I don't know of a better example in our time of the pitfalls of over-empathizing. Think about it. Young women, which are the most at risk of rape and sexual assault, are indirectly voting in large numbers for the increased chance that they'll be raped or sexually assaulted. Now, before you flip out and start bashing the keyboard with cries of misogyny in the comments, no, I'm not saying women are voting to get raped. I'm saying this is a direct implication of putting emotions and feelings before facts and evidence, and that the rise of the feelings over facts social justice movement couldn't have happened at a worse time when a more thoughtful, rational examination of the implications of mass immigration needs to be undertaken. Possibly one ray of light is that the Austrians will be going to the polls again to vote, since the election result was annulled on the grounds that the election rules had been broken in a way that could have influenced the result. More specifically, the improper handling of postal votes. But it remains to be seen if the result will be any different and to what extent the empathically compromised will vote with their feelings and emotions or stop to consider the facts and evidence.